I have about 15 minutes to convince you of why CSS is actually good and why you should be using it in your project. In general, I will try to give you a bit of an overview of what CSS is and what SASS actually is. I try to make it not very technical, but it's kind of impossible. So I will try to explain you a bit what CSS is, how you can add it to Shiny, how it's actually different from SASS, how you could use a SASS instead of a normal CSS on your projects. I have a few resources and I have a bonus section if we still have some time. So to start, what is CSS? So CSS, cascading styles sheets, it's basically almost as old as HTML is. And it's a language, more like a syntax that describes how the elements are actually to be displayed. Basically, every CSS statement consists of two parts. One of them is the outside part of the brackets, which is the selector for the elements, and a set of rules that live inside of the elements. The outside part tells what is the object that will be object or objects that will be affected. The inside tells you what are the rules that are applied. One of the best things about CSS is that you can have one set of rules that works in more than one page at the same time. So this means that as long as you keep the pages consistent, you don't have to redo any of the style. So how can you add this to Shiny right now? Currently, there are three big ways of doing it. You can add it directly to the text while you are coding. You can add it to the header of your application, or you can save it in a separate file and just simply link that file. So about adding style directly to the text. So here we have an example of a very simple H1 tag. So it's a title. It has some text and it has some style. So most of I think all of the tags in Shiny, all of the HTML tags actually have this attribute, this parameter that you can pass some CSS into it. What is the worst thing? This is probably the worst option of the three, simply because there are two really bad things. If your code is too big, you're going to forget where you put it. And if you are using the same element in more than one place, then you'll have to repeat the styling again. So that means that if you have, for example, 5 titles for 5 different pages, if the client decides they want to change the color of the title, you have to find the 5 places where you define it. The second one, adding it to the header, it's a tiny bit better. Basically, you can define a tag to the header with whatever your CSS rules are inside. This is a tiny bit better because you are defining it outside of the actual HTML elements that you create. But at the same time, because you are still doing it in the code, you're not using a separate file. And because you're not using a separate file, you cannot, for example, cache this. That means that you are still missing some of the options that make CSS really good. The third one, which is actually adding the file, has a lot more advantages. It makes the code look much cleaner. You have a completely separate place for the file, for all the rules. And not only that, you can also add more than one file. So you can have a bit of a structure to however you want to style however you want to save your style. So what about SASS versus CSS? So I didn't go too much into the details of what CSS are because I think at least most of the tech team knows how it works. If you don't, we can talk about it some other time. But what is SASS indeed? The biggest difference, the biggest way to explain it is that SASS basically is a preprocessor for CSS. So SASS is a way of writing CSS without writing CSS. It gives you kind of a subset of functions and other structures that, when compiled, when processed, become normal CSS. The difference is that you have other tools that, as a developer, make a bit more sense. So for me, the four big differences between the two is that SASS is object-oriented. So that means that you don't have simply statements like I showed you before. You have actual objects that work in the SASS environment. So you can have variables, you can have nesting. They work a bit more like an actual language and not so much as a syntax. So like I said, it allows nesting. This means that you can define elements inside of other elements. If you know a bit of CSS, this means that whenever you define an element inside of another element, you are basically saying that the full rule needs to be an element that's inside of another element. So instead of having to create multiple rules for that, you can create just one. It also allows variables, and I will explain this a tiny bit more later. And it also, because it's object-oriented, it allows you to define sets of properties outside of the actual statements and then reuse them multiple times. So SASS has three big advantages. The first one is called a mixin. And a mixin is basically a function that it's a statement that doesn't really exist in your code, but can be used as an object with multiple attributes. So in this case, we have a typical CSS statement. So we have a row class that is being given some CSS properties. What we can do is we can extract these properties into a mixin, and you do this by adding the mixin word from SASS, and then you name it somehow, and you add whatever rules you want inside. And then when you are creating your SASS, instead of setting every attribute by hand, you simply include the mixin into that statement. This means that if you want to use this 10 times, you can just include it 10 times instead of defining it 10 times. The second one is functions, and this is something that I think most people know. So SASS actually allows you to define a function, and it works the exact same way. It just has a bit of a different syntax from what you're used to. So you can define a function by using the add function. You give it a name, and you give it some parameters, and you give it a return statement of what you want it to return. SASS also lets you use a few functions that are already pre-built. So percentage is an example of them. You have sum, you have average, you have a few. There's like a big list of them. So in this case, for example, we are creating a function that takes a number and can also take a total, but by default it's 8, and returns the percentage of the number that it took divided by the total. So basically, this lets you create a width that works a bit like the bootstrap columns, that you have a total of how many columns you want to have in your project, and then you say, oh, and for this specific class, I wanted to occupy X thirds of the X amount of the screen. The third thing that SASS does really well is you can make loops. You can make loops and conditions, and the loops are a really easy way of creating large amounts of CSS without having to repeat yourself. So if we use, for example, the same function from before, we can put that inside of a loop and create one class for each of those possible widths that we talked about. Any questions so far? No? So how can you use SASS in R? So RStudio released this really cool library called SASS. And SASS basically lets you do all of this coding that I talked before, without actually having to use any external tool for it. So the main way that you can use it is the library exposes a function called SASS, and this function takes either a string or a file and returns the compiled CSS for whatever you fed it. So that means that you can either define it directly on the code wherever you want. So that means that you can have variables that are set in your application, and then the styling is defined whenever you run the application. So if you have, for example, a variable that defines the background color of the application, you can then generate the actual styling rules just for that. The most typical way and the way that I think you should use it is by actually giving it a SASS file. And a SASS file can have a lot of different things. I will quickly show you how complex they can actually get, so don't be scared. So this is an example. On the right side, you can see an example of the file structure that you can have in the project, which is the one that I usually like to use. And it basically consists of a main file and then all of the other files that have small parts of your code and usually are divided into some way of logically dividing organizing your project. So the main file is usually the file that you pass to the function, and it basically lets you import every single file that you want. And one important thing is that the order matters. So for example, if you want to have a file with all of your variables defined in the beginning, it should be the first file that you pass. And then you can use all of those variables in the rest of the files. Okay, so I added a few resources. If you want to learn a bit more about SASS, you should read the SASS vignettes. It has a lot of different examples of how to use it. If you want to use SASS in your project, I linked the Git repo, but if you need a bit of help, because the documentation isn't as good as it could, so you can just ask me for whatever. I already made it work, so you can just ask me. If you're very new to CSS, WT3 Schools has a really nice tutorial and kind of a knowledge repository about all the different rules that you can use. And if you want to see some really nice examples of how SASS can be implemented in an application, there's some really nice examples from R and the package that they did. Any questions?
I have one question.
Okay.
Maybe it's not strictly related to SASS, but I wanted to learn how you generally work with styling applications. For example, when you want to experiment and test some style, you have an idea to style this button, and you just want to make it quick. Would you use rather developer console and style it and then pass what you created to SASS, or you have other workflows, something like
usually the workflow is developer console. If you already have a working application and you just want to style a specific element, there isn't a very easy way of passing from CSS into SASS. So usually the best option that you have is, and what I usually use, is every time there is some new value that is very generic to the application, for example, a color, I try to save it as a variable. So this means that they are easily reusable. One important thing to keep in mind is that you shouldn't name a variable, dark blue, because tomorrow the client decides that blue isn't a good color and he wants green. So you should always try to use the same with naming classes in HTML. Naming variables in SASS should always be as agnostic as possible. So you should use primary color, for example, or secondary color, or primary color black or alpha, or something like that. The idea is that you can use something that when you see it, you know what the color palette is. But if for some reason the color palette changes, you can simply change it in one play. There is also a really good plugin for Chrome, which is called VisBug, and VisBug actually lets you inspect specific elements and change them on the fly. So this is also something that maybe I can add to the resources, because you can check sizes, you can check what every specific element is. You can kind of visually alter the styling, even if you don't have access to the code. So if you are, for example, if you want, for example, to check how a new logo in your website looks like, you can use something like this to simply change the colors or change the image and actually check it. A lot of the work is very hands-on, and you have to try things to see how they work. When you work from mockups, it's usually a bit easier because you already have all of those visual cues from the designer, and sometimes you can even get mockups that already come with some CSS code. So that helps even more. Then it's just a way of it's extraction. It's in the end, it's having a big piece of code that you just want to reuse and extract as much as you can.
Another question. If you go back to the example of a Shiny app with SASS.
1 second. I don't know what we did. Shiny app with SASS.
Yeah, so do you know if there's any overhead on generating SASS from the file? And if we do it for every session, or is it done only once when the server starts?
The SASS function actually contains a parameter, which is an output file. So one of the ways that you can actually run it only once, usually the overhead is not very big, even if you compile it on runtime. But you can define a file that basically becomes your main CSS file, and instead of adding the SASS folder, you simply add that file, and that file can then be cached. So you can pass an extra parameter to the SASS function that says if the file exists and it's the most recent version, then don't recompile it.
Okay, my feeling is that we should always try to do it in production apps, because this supposedly can influence performance, especially if we aim for large scale, because I think that RStudio hasn't implemented SASS in R. So that means that for every compilation, then they run syscall, which seems to be quite heavy, especially for a runtime.
But one important thing to keep in mind is that this is, I believe this is a C++ library, and it's incredibly fast. The last time I measured the compiling about even more than those files on the left, it took around 5 milliseconds to create the new code. However, using the output as a file is definitely a better option, especially if we want to have some caching for it, because the file will be generated once. After it's generated, the only thing that the application will do in runtime is check if something changed or not.
Yes, and even 5 milliseconds for 500 users, like, multiplies, right?
Of course, of course.
Have you considered other CSS preprocessors, or how would you compare them in context of Shiny? Or is it just good enough? And
this is good enough, and this preprocessor is actually implemented in around 30 different languages, I think. Simply because it's open source, it's been refined and refined and refined, and it just became kind of the standard library to preprocess CSS. There is an alternative to SASS called less, although less is usually they used to be very toe-to-toe, but SASS kind of won the race, and less kind of started being left behind.
Pedro, do you think it should be a standard in our work, in our templates, for example, that like in our workflow, how we work on the project, on different projects?
It depends on, I think it depends on the amount of styling that you want to add to the project. Because if we're talking about a simple dashboard that uses semantic UI and doesn't actually need a lot of styling, then SASS is definitely overkill. A really good way of looking at it is you need at least 3 SASS files plus a library just to implement SASS. And this can easily be replaced by a simple CSS file. So if you have 5, 10, 15 exceptions to whatever styling library you're already using, I don't see a point. If you want something bigger, something that has a lot of customization, then definitely I think this is the best option. Even if you lose a bit of time implementing it, and even if you lose a bit on actually creating it, your brain will thank you when you don't have a 2,000-line CSS file.
Another question, maybe again related generally to the CSS. Do you have any method? Maybe maybe SASS helps you in that. How you assess what priority you want to give to your CSS rule. I mean, when you apply, let's say we have an application that already uses Bootstrap, and also we added semantic UI. I had this case, and on top of it, we have our custom styles, and you want to make some element use your style you defined, but you don't want to go into that hack using important. You want to balance your rule, right?
Bootstrap, a good example of Bootstrap is you can compile from the Bootstrap website your own version of Bootstrap.
Yeah.
So you could compile something without the element you want to style, and then you don't have to use important. However, that usually doesn't happen because Bootstrap comes from some framework that you added to the project or some library, and it's already there, and you cannot do much. One rule about CSS is that if the selector is more specific than the generic selector that already exists, then that selector becomes the
and my question in the applications, like the long list of classes,
yes.
And they were getting very complicated.
Yes.
And I couldn't add, let's say, ID to this element. I could only use classes. Yeah, I know this is the general rule and how CSS calculates it. But
one really easy way is if you have, for example, access to the full rule that you want to override, you can add that rule plus just one extra class. It can even be the same class. Because if you have, for example, class, I don't know, blah blah. Blah blah is the class of the element that you want to edit. But if you do dot blah blah dot blah blah, then it becomes more specific than just once.
Nice.
So that kind of overrides
I suggest we continue the discussion, but declare the a break for who wants to go to the break, and we can continue discussing CSS.
Normally, you still have 6 minutes. I think we will, on my presentation, catch up this time.
So there is a, if you want to write a rule, I think there is also a
root.
Important you can add after the rule, and it jumps like to the top then.
The problem with important is, what if you use important and then you have to use important again?
Yeah.
Exactly.
So usually you should try to avoid important as much as possible. And even I'm guilty of this, of using it too much. Sometimes there's no other sane way of doing it. But sometimes there's alternatives. There's also a pseudo element called root. So if you add root dot rule to the beginning of your selector, it also works as a higher level. It almost, for the CSS, it's like, oh, there's one more element here, so it's more specific. Okay. So there are a few small workarounds. I can actually maybe compile a list of small workarounds. And actually, the bonus that I had is selectors in CSS that you might not know. And there's a few interesting ones. So, for example, asterisk targets everything on the page. So this is usually very useful for resetting the styles. So the problem you had before. Bootstrap is already included in the application. What should I do? One thing you can do is, if you want, for example, to remove all of the margins that Bootstrap adds, you can just use the asterisk as a selector and set all the margins to 0. In this case, I think you would probably need to use important, but again, sometimes the idea is to keep it same. The second one is something that people usually don't know. You can target specific elements by attributes. So if you don't know a class, but you have, for example, a link that has a specific href, you can target that in CSS.
Could you target an input with specific value?
You can, and you can also target specific data attributes, so metadata.
Yeah. So if I provide specific input to this input, this style will change.
Yes.
All right.
As long as it's an HTML attribute, you can target it with CSS. The next two ones, which is the tilde and the plus, are actually sibling selectors. One thing that CSS doesn't have is upwards searchability. It always starts from the top and goes all the way to the children. However, it does have sibling selectors. So in this case, if you use tilde, you can target any Y element that has an X before them. So if you have 3 Ys and an X in the beginning, it will target all of those Ys. If you use the plus, it will actually target all the Ys that have the X before it. So in this case, it will target only the first Y. So sometimes it's useful when you have libraries that change the structure of the elements and add something there, and then you have to style it. But you can only style it if you know one of the other elements that are in the same container. First of type and last of type are new selectors that basically let you pick exactly the first and the last. So if you have, for example, a list or a menu and you want to add some underlining or some side borders to it, you can then, for example, target the last and remove the last one.
The general selector for it is end element.
Yes, it's on the second page. The not is also a very interesting one because you can give it another selector inside of the not and exclude specific things. So if you have, for example, all elements of a menu except the active one, you can do item ... not select, not active or something. The one you were talking about, Pavel, is the end of type, and end of type is a more generic version of first and last, and this takes a condition inside, and this condition can be a lot of different things. It can be odd or even, which are keyword trigger odd or even. It can be just a number to target a specific position. or it can be this lovely formula, which basically means the size of the cycle. So if you give it a tree, it means that it will run every 3 elements. N is just a generic variable, and B is the offset of the cycle from the beginning. So if you give it, for example, a 2, it will start the cycle from the 3rd element. Yes. Now it's time.
Do you know the parent selector?
Yes.
But now it's end time.
Such selector doesn't exist.
No.
Okay, we can speak about this.
There is some ideas of making it a standard, but it's not. It's still not defined for. It's still not a pattern for every browser.
Okay.